Hi, I want to make a long video on the subject of how we like our own biases and opinions. Other people's input on our actions can have an effect on us, and how we can always have that control us more than we necessarily think it can be controlling us. And a good example is someone gives you a bit of advice, even though they don't necessarily know your circumstance. They give you some advice, regardless of their knowledge of your circumstance or their experience. You can take their advice, but sometimes you can take their advice and take it too far. You can get someone else's advice, and you get someone else's advice, and you don't necessarily know whose advice to take. Someone's opinion, someone's bias, they get to you, sort of like having your own projection and putting it on them, and all of a sudden thinking they think exactly what you think, even though they didn't necessarily describe it the exact same way, or it's just based on an association of one or two words in a sentence. All of a sudden you think that they think exactly what you think of yourself, or whatever it may be. Um, People's manipulations or biases or opinions can easily influence us. People say a person gives you advice, another person gives you advice. A person that you have more reverence for, you feel like has more experience, all of a sudden you're going to take their advice more seriously. That's almost a bias. That's our biases. And the biases, not only their biases, but the bias that you have of their advice or opinion about a certain circumstance and how you may go about or deal with a problem. And that can obviously get in the way more than you necessarily think, and it can be an obstruction. It can be a roadblock. You don't necessarily know what's the best circumstance, and the circumstance can always contradict some person's opinion or advice. So it's not always going to be the best case if you follow someone's advice a certain way. You can always say, well, I know the circumstance now. I know exactly what's happening. I can see what's happening. I know that this isn't necessarily what the person was expecting when I told them what I would be doing. So I'm going to do things my way now. I took their advice up to this point. Now I'm going to branch off and do things my way. Or I'm going to know I know best what the circumstance now. I take my gut. I can only take my experiences based on my own projections and perceptions as best I can. I can understand to a certain extent some circumstances where I can take a person's objective advice to a certain extent. Don't harm anyone else. But if a person's harming you or about to harm someone else or 10 other people, then you have to harm someone else. So sometimes you can't take the advice so seriously that don't hurt anyone else. All of a sudden that starts diluting your mind. And all of a sudden you can think that all of a sudden, okay, well, this person has 20 people, he's about to blow up a room with a bomb in it, and he's going to kill 20 people, or he's going to slowly stab people to death and let them die slowly. This person said, don't hurt anyone in any circumstance. Try to find a peaceful solution. There's no peaceful solution in the circumstance, and you just end up letting everyone die, including yourself. But that's not always the circumstance that's best for the situation. So I guess I have to take matters into my own hands, overcome that delusion, that psychology of manipulation, into thinking that other people's advice or reverence my bias for their advice, all of a sudden should go away, and recognize that I can take matters in my own hands. I don't have to always have other people think for me. I can think for myself and not let anyone else get in the way. And it's very hard sometimes to recognize exactly what you should do. All of a sudden, that person's opinion becomes your opinion and becomes almost an internal battle of what should I do? I'm stuck between a rock and a hard place. I can't do that. Oh, wait, that's right, I can. That person just said I shouldn't do it, but I could. And you almost realize that that was holding you back so much. A person giving you an opinion now all of a sudden becomes your principle or your opinion based on just some small bit of advice, based on, say, a routine or some kind of habit you have, or a preconceived notion or some kind of anything like that. All of a sudden you realize, oh wait, I can do it. There's always another option, but sometimes you close off the other options thinking it's impossible, and then it becomes a revelation. Oh wait, I can. And that becomes another option. And that's something that many people don't understand to a certain extent. It can change. Um, and sometimes you close those off and you don't realize, because you have such a preconceived notion, you're blocking yourself off from reality. You can be so closed in a bubble you don't realize. We're all caught in our own bubbles in different ways. We just don't realize it. We all have egos. We have all the mechanisms that control us. We have a self-propelling mechanism of just existence that we obviously, now that we exist, we have to do something. And just because a person seems to be enjoying their existence doesn't mean that they would have wouldn't have rather not have been. They probably would have rather not have been, but now they have to do something. They're forced into interacting a certain way, the reconfiguration of their existence. They have a sentience now. All these different things created their existence. Now they're going to move on a certain way with an intention, and an interaction that exists with a sentient force feedback mechanism of feeling and sensation and value. And those things do exist. And that's an objective reality that we can say easily. And taking other people's advice and recognizing the facts can be different than taking a person's advice based on circumstances that you can expect. You can just say persons, regardless of the person, they have value. Yes, we can understand that objectively, and I can take that advice understandably. I can say I could take that advice and know that is not just advice, but is knowing that as facts. But that doesn't mean that the person, okay, they gave you that advice, everyone has value, it doesn't matter who it is. Even if it's a perpetrator, obviously it's a circumstance controlling them, and we can't blame the circumstance. We can only blame the things in the circumstance. We can blame the circumstance, but the circumstance we can't do anything to. We can't make the circumstance suffer any consequences. So yeah, we can't make the circumstance suffer any consequences for its actions, and we can only do so much to the circumstance. And we can only do so much to make the circumstance pay for its actions. So even if a person, just trying to remember the ideas, so if a person says that the circumstance is, yeah, back to the basic idea. So yes, the circumstance, we can only do so much, and it's the circumstance we can blame, and we know that it doesn't matter who it is, it's the value that matters, and the value is based on circumstance, and the circumstance is what makes everyone else have value, because the circumstance is the real perpetrator, but we can't blame the circumstance. The circumstance doesn't have anything. It's the thing that causes everything, and it doesn't have any value beyond the thing that it controls these things. But just because it controls it doesn't mean it has value. And that's what gives it value. And taking that bit of advice, that bit of knowledge, of reality, we can say, okay, everyone has value, but that person can also say, don't harm anyone. So you say, okay, that everyone has value, doesn't matter who it is, and don't harm anyone, regardless of what happens. But then again, or just say, generally speaking, don't harm anyone. And then all of a sudden you're stuck out in a circumstance, say, where a school shooter comes in and you have their backs to you, and you can, or you can call the cops or whatever it is, or that's not a good example, or you can smash them in the back of the head, or any circumstance where you feel like you can change something, but you have to hurt someone, maybe even kill someone, or mortally wound someone, or horribly injure someone. Sometimes that's the way you can pull the gun out of the back of their holster and just shoot them in the head, shoot them in the leg. Don't hurt anyone under what circumstances. Obviously, the circumstances, depending on the circumstance controlling the value is also controlling the circumstance that's going to create more value. So if it's preventing more bad value to cause someone to contradict that bit of advice to contradict that person's advice to not hurt anyone, then you have to hurt someone to prevent other people from getting hurt. And it's about people not getting hurt, and everyone has value, and it's about preventing more people from having value. So if that perpetrator is going to cause more value deprivation in other people, it's best for me to prevent it, to cause it in him, so that he will not cause it in other people. So it's me practicing that everyone has value, therefore it's about all these people, and I know this person's not going to allow all these people, he's going to, this thing, circumstance is going to is going to cause all of these other values to have suffer. So it's best for the most amount of value, therefore I have to make a decision, a value weight decision, a value equation decision, and I realize that all these people mean more than this one person, therefore this one person has to be hurt. I have to contradict that piece of advice, and therefore I have the facts on my side, and I realize that all this value means more than this one person. And I take matters in my own hands, contradict that advice, hurt that person to prevent all these other people from getting hurt. It doesn't matter who suffers, but it's about preventing more suffering than less. It's about preventing more suffering. So since it's just one against, say, 20 people, I'll choose the one person, and it's better it be that person, because that person's going to feel deterrence, or it's going to prevent something bad from happening to more value. So it's sort of like the contradiction of advice, but taking that advice and realizing you could flip it on its head and use it to change the circumstances. and realizing the circumstances control the value, and so on and so forth. So I think that's it. It's a basic idea, and I think I got the idea across good enough. It's about value and how other people's we can obviously let people get in our way and easily manipulate us, sort of like our own biases, our own opinions, other people's advice. We realize that sometimes, oh wait, I can contradict that advice easily. I just have to think for myself a little more and realize I can break that barrier and think for myself and not realize it's not as much of a brick wall or an impenetrable wall or in between a rock and a hard place or making a mountain out of a molehill as much as you think, then you're making it more than it actually exists. And you can always consider other options and not necessarily always let people's opinions or pieces of advice manipulate you. And that's what many people sometimes take it as gospel based on their biases and their preconceived notions and experiences based on some experience that they have with some kind of piece of advice or where the advice is coming from. And it's about overcoming that advice, overcoming those biases and preconceived notions, and don't letting it delude you or fool you anymore. And that's all you can do. You can only do so much, and that's obviously an easy first step in taking to not being so easily disillusioned or so easily disillusioned is to not actually not take anyone else's advice, only take people's advice that you trust, or even taking your own advice. So it's easy enough subject. And value, weight, and judgment as well is another thing I covered in this video, and that's obviously something to consider in contradicting advice and contradicting realizing value and realizing even if it doesn't matter who is experiencing the suffering. If the person that's about to cause some suffering, the one person or two people, is going to cause 20 or 30 people to suffer, even greater. It depends on the great amount of suffering. If you had to make these two guys or people suffer unimaginable pain of being boiled alive, and they were just going to say shoot everyone in the head, I would almost say to a certain extent, obviously, if everyone gets shot in the head, then those people are going to be the family members, say, will suffer. And it's about knowing the value equation as best as you can. You can only know so much. But being boiled alive, to say close circumstance where these two guys are being boiled alive, and then everyone else just gets shot in the head. Then obviously there's suffering, but then again, it's about making that value judgment. It becomes a little more difficult then. Being boiled alive is different than being shot in the head until you die. And then obviously if you don't close the circumstance, you realize it has an effect on everyone else. It has an interaction. About closing off and contriving effects, we can't do that, but we can close the circumstance and make a contrivance, say in an closed experiment, and seeing how things work out. We can only do so much to change the circumstances. But yes, then the family members and people that knew him would obviously suffer. Then again, it would obviously be best for those two guys to boil alive, and it doesn't matter who. Say the two perpetrators that boil alive that were about to say shoot the people in the head. Obviously, it depends on the circumstance, what value weights, how many things, how many value points, or whatever it is that's going to be suffered, and how long, and just the value points in general. We can only know so much, and generally speaking, we do what we know is right. The perpetrator is going to usually suffer the consequences, and we're obviously going to take the action into our own hands. So, yeah. So, generally speaking, that's the case. And obviously, it's a difficult value judgment sometimes to consider these things because we don't necessarily know the long-lasting impact. You can save these 20 people, but then again, that can have an interaction causing another school shooting that wouldn't have happened because they saw the two guys do it. And they said, oh, well, that's so bad. I can't do that. Could have prevented 50 school shootings from just letting this one go. But then again, you can only do so much. You can only have a reasonable expectation so far in understanding the implications of your actions. And it's about prevention, and you can only prevent so much knowing so much. And it's about that knowledge, and the more knowledge you have, the more responsibility you have, and that's where that responsibility comes from, is all this knowledge and knowing the circumstances of reality, and knowing how that has an effect. We can only know so much regardless of how much you know. You can only know so much, and you're not going to know everything. So you have to take everything to a certain extent with a grain of salt. So there's only so much you can do. It's about making those value judgments and not letting people manipulate you and let that become a bias in your brain, and realizing that you can always overcome those things. So even though it doesn't matter who suffers, sometimes you just have to make that judgment. One person, everyone dying horribly on planet Earth, every 150 billion people that have existed dying like over the course of 10 days is not worth one person dying or suffering forever in a pit of flame. Even if a good example is Adolf Hitler, even if he, caused all that suffering, he doesn't deserve to rot forever in hell, because it's about the value. And remember, it only takes one person to suffer. And if that person's suffering more than the collective of everyone else suffering, that's all it takes. No one should suffer. The circumstances control who's the victim, who's the perpetrator. We're all victims of the circumstance, and we're being pitted against each other based on the puppeteer strings that are controlling us. And it only takes one person to suffer, regardless of all the circumstances surrounding them, for it to make it not worth it. A person does not need to suffer forever. Doesn't need to suffer at all, even if they did something, because it's about preventing suffering, not causing more. But they don't deserve to suffer forever, because they caused so much more suffering. It's not, these people aren't suffering forever. This person doesn't need to suffer forever, even if he caused horrible pain and suffering in everyone else, because that value would be greater than everyone else suffering. It's about the value. And it doesn't matter how many people, it doesn't matter who it is, this matters that there's value there and it's existing. But if one person has to die rot forever or suffer forever, and or it's 50 people, the one person has the obligation. But that circumstance obviously is a contrivance, and there's no suffering forever that exists. It's a contrivance. So even though it seems like a very difficult thought experiment to think about, it's something that doesn't exist. There's only you die or 5 other people die horribly. There's no forever. There's you rot in prison or 5 other people rot in prison. It's about making those decisions, and the forever idea is just a contrivance, a non-existent kind of concept. We can keep doing this. That doesn't mean we can't stop. We can say forever because it's keep going, but it keeps going until it stops, and that's when forever ends. Until it stops. We don't know. Unidentified, we don't know yet. Sort of like we can't change the past, and we can only describe things so much in the past, and then in the future we can only know forever as long as something is happening until it ends. And that's the description. Forever until it ends. Infinite until it ends. Sort of like we can describe everything, but it's not infinite. We can only describe so much. It's finite, but we can only describe so much. And what's already happened we can't describe. We've missed all of the description we can. And we can only go forward, and we can't describe everything. But it doesn't mean it's infinite. It just means that we can only do so much. In reality, it already describes itself. Anyway, so that's a contrivance in and of itself in making those distinctions. We can't describe it, and the description we can't make anyway. It's just existing, and exists in a certain way, and that existence led from you to existing to dying to living. What's the point in existing? It leads from you to an end, and it's just the redundant process of the futility and pointlessness of not being able to change the very fundamental nature of reality. And that's where the futility mostly comes from, and not in the futility of recognizing that you can mitigate against it. And the mitigation of one person suffering is all we can really hope for, even if the expectation is low. Even if our expectation is high, we should find at least some satisfaction in helping one person. Because that's all we can have an expectation for, is helping so many people in a world so rife full of suffering and deprivation. So, yeah. Doesn't matter who it is, but sometimes you just gotta make the judgment. Sometimes the person that causing the suffering is just as much as valuable as the person experiencing the circumstances as a victim. Doesn't matter who it is. You shouldn't cause a person to suffer forever just because he caused horrible suffering in millions of people, or whatever it may be. But that's a contrivance, and it's a false example. It's a non-existent example. I think that's all there is to mention anyway. For the subject, it's an easy enough subject as it is. So I think that's all I need to say. If there's anything else, I could always mention another video. So thank you, and until next time. Bye.